Hello, everyone. Welcome back to War and Literature, English 1120. I'm Tim Wilson. Tonight, we're going to have the first of 4 lectures on Shakespeare's Henry V. So I want to call up the presentation that will guide us through that discussion right now. And tonight's lecture, the first of 4, as I said, will cover the introductory material to the play. And we'll also talk about the chorus and the function of the chorus throughout the play. In our next lecture, we'll look at what I've called the skeptical interpretation of the play. That means, let's say, an interpretation of the play that's more distrusting of the general line that Henry V is to be celebrated. Then we'll have in the third lecture a look at to what extent the play explores this theme of how the war brings together England and celebrates the unity of the various peoples through that war, through that common struggle. And then in our last lecture, we'll look at the Battle of Agincourt historically and as portrayed. We'll look at some textual considerations of the play and try to draw some conclusions in general. Before we get started on some of the issues that I want to look at in the play, I think it's good just to summarize what basically happens, make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the actual plot and actions of the play. So we have an outline of the play here in the next few slides, and so I'll just go through one by one and give a sense of what's going on. So the first one, we have this chorus function that begins every act. Okay, so Act 1 begins with the chorus. That's the first thing we see as the play opens, is with a single actor out there playing a chorus who calls for a muse of fire to help create the huge story about to be told. And the chorus, this first chorus, apologizes to the audience that the theater, this wooden O that they are in, is too limited to show the proper size and power of this war. And he asks the audience to use their imaginations to bring the play to life. And then in Act 1, Scene 1, we have, as I say, the problem of the church is presented. We have 2 bishops in that scene who are worried that the church will lose a lot of money if a new law is passed. And they have offered money to Henry to fund his war in France in the hope that with this war that he would forget about this potential law that would have negative consequences for the church. In Act 1, Scene 2, before Henry sees these French ambassadors that have come from France to bring a message, he demands to know if his claim to the French throne is legal. And the Archbishop of Canterbury explains at great length in a long and tedious speech how Henry's claim is, quote, as clear as the summer's sun. And at this point, the French ambassadors enter with a gift from the Dauphin, who is the king's son. He has sent Henry a box of tennis balls. So it's a way of mocking the youth of Henry. Henry is enraged, but stays in control. He retorts that these tennis balls will be returned in the court of France as gunstones, and takes it as a challenge to war, so to speak. Then in Act 2, the prologue there is painting a patriotic image of England, telling the audience how everyone is on fire to be at war with France, and everyone is thinking of his or her honor. But we're also warned about not every Englishman feels that way, and that there are 3 traitors that are about to be exposed. And the chorus says that they'll move the action to Southampton. That's where that chorus closes off at the beginning of Act 2 there. But as I said, this is kind of a misrepresentation, because the next scene is actually in London. So the plot moves, remains in London, and Henry's old friends from that we know from previous plays, Bardolph and Nym, and Pistol are presented. Pistol has married another character that was presented in these earlier plays, Mistress Nell Quickly, and a boy that is an attendant to them enters with news that Falstaff, Henry's old drinking friend, is very ill. In Act 2, Scene 2, the conspiracy is uncovered, and the three conspirators are sentenced to death. So Henry is able to treat, well, first of all, expose, but also treat rather ruthlessly anyone who's found to be conspiring against him, which in this case is a sign of his resolution, so to speak. In Act 2, Scene 3, back at the tavern in East Cheap, we learn that Falstaff is dead, and Mistress quickly describes this death in a moving scene. I say Falstaff and Socrates there because that scene, the description of that scene, as we'll see later, is very reminiscent of the description of the death of Socrates. And we'll want to think about what's Shakespeare doing there in paralleling these two figures. In Act 2, Scene 4, we see the French camp, or the French court. The French king, Charles, is preparing for the English invasion. And the Dauphin, again, his son doesn't believe that there's really any danger because he holds Harry in such low regard, but his father is more of a wise ruler, let's say, and reminds him of France's past defeats at the hands of the English. And so again, this is, let's say, kind of an English nationalistic strain to this. Then the prologue, or the chorus to Act 3. The prologue describes the sea voyage and asks the audience to try to imagine this sea voyage. And in Act 3, Scene 1, here we see Henry delivering a rousing speech to urge his troops into battle, and starting with the famous speech saying, "Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more." So it's a powerful speech that tries to get the English to put aside their stillness, their humility, let's say these Christian virtues, and to rouse their rage, their martial virtues. And he calls on them as equals to some extent. In Act 3, Scene 2, we see, let's say, the immediate effect, or maybe non-effect, of the speech, depending on how you read it. So we go from the rousing words of the king to the lower characters again, Nym, Bardolph, Pistol, and the others. And Bardolph is crying on to the breach, but Nym tells him to wait until the battle calms down. He's saying, this is, why go in there now? It's too dangerous. So rather than calling up these martial virtues, we see the cowardice of these lower characters. Then this Welsh captain Llewellyn, or Llewellyn, depending on the editor, arrives and forces them to join the fighting. It leaves the boy alone on stage, who gives a little soliloquy about his poor fate with these sad characters. In Act 3, Scene 3, we have Harry's, again, another memorable speech, Harry's ultimatum to the leader of Harfleur, the governor of this city that's under siege by the English forces. He threatens them that if the governor doesn't surrender immediately, his troops will show no mercy there. And he goes into a lot of detail about the bloody acts of rape and putting skewering infants on spikes, etc. These these types of horrible images that will occur if he doesn't surrender. The governor does surrender because he announces that their call to have relief from the Dauphin has failed, that the Dauphin won't be arriving. So Henry at the end of the play tells Exeter to use mercy on them. So there's two sides of Henry being shown there. So there's this horrible speech, this threatening speech, and the amount of depravity that he's potentially willing to use on them, and as well as this notion of mercy at the end. Act 3, Scene 4, what I've called a language lesson here, moves to a kind of a lighter, more comic scene from that height of the horror of war, where we're in a French palace where the Princess Catherine, she kind of sees what's happening and says, maybe I have to learn English here. Maybe we're about to be conquered. Maybe I'll be married off to this other king. And she asks to be taught by her maid Alice some English, and some comic mispronunciations of the words happen there. Some comedy in terms of how Catherine feels that some of the English words sound like French swear words. Then in Act 3, Scene 5, we're at the French camp, and there's the court talks about Henry's progress. The noblemen insult the barbarous English, calling them, slobs, and they're from a dirty country. And we hear at this point how the English troops are sick and underfed. So that hasn't really come through, but historically that was the case. This English campaign suffered from dysentery, and from they were famished during these sieges where they didn't have supplies, and we hadn't really been exposed to that point in the earlier scenes. So in Act 3, Scene 6, Henry arrives at a portion of the English camp where his old friend Bardolph is being accused and ordered to execution for having robbed a church, and it had been Henry's strict orders not to pillage the land or the countryside, and Bardolph had broken that rule, and rather than show any mercy again on this former friend, Henry shows no reaction, no sign of recognition even of this old friend, and orders his execution. A lot of echoes there of the renunciation of Falstaff at the end of Henry IV, Part 2. Then in Act 3, Scene 7, kind of a funny scene actually. There's the French camp the night before the battle. They're impatient for the morning. They're so confident that they're going to win. Oh, I can't wait till morning. We're going to, really triumph tomorrow. And they're these French aristocrats, so mounted knights, who are praising their horses in almost a parody of medieval love poetry conventions of praising an unattainable lady. Then the prologue to Act 4, the chorus here is talking about how Henry V is, the night before the battle, is walking through the troops, lifting up the spirits of the troops, and again points out the problem of trying to represent war on a small stage with only 4 or 5 swords and in a brawl, ridiculous, quote unquote. In Act 4, Scene 1, Henry does walk through the English camp, as the chorus had mentioned, but he does so in disguise. And rather than cheering and lifting the spirits of these troops, he actually gets into a debate and argument with a couple of these common soldiers, Bates, Court, and Williams, and in particular Williams, who's making the point that all deaths are the responsibility of the king. So the responsibility of the deaths of these soldiers in the battle to come rests on the shoulders of the king. Henry in disguise is saying, well, everyone is going to make their own individual choices, and if they don't die, well, if they commit sins on their way to death, that's not on the sin on the shoulders or the conscience of the king. And they vow if they see one another the next day, they'll wear signs that they would duel the next day. So rather than lifting in the spirits, he gets into kind of a little spat with one of the soldiers, you could say. In Act 4, Scene 2, it shows again the French camp. They're once again confident of their victory and can't wait for the next day. Act 4, Scene 3. This is again at the English camp just before the battle. They are hearing reports of how many soldiers are in the French camp, around 60,000 or full three score thousand of fresh soldiers. And Westmoreland, one of the leading nobles there, wishes they had more men. And Henry hears this and gives another rousing speech, often called the St. Crispin's Day speech, and says that, not to wish that they had one more, because they will in years to come, when they're back in England, they'll be so proud to have fought with this small band of brothers that fought so many in Agincourt on Crispin's Day. And again, this wee band of brothers, this sense of the king as leader, making himself one of the many, and as a way of inspiring the troops. In Act 4, Scene 4, it shows Pistol, again, one of those lower characters from the pub, who has a French prisoner that he's extorting for money. And at the end of that scene, the boy, who is the attendant of these characters, mentions that he has to return to the camp, that it's only guarded by other boys or pages. So it's an ominous foreshadowing of what will happen to these boys later in the battle. So in Act 4, Scene 5, we learn that against all odds, the English are winning. And the French shows the French nobles, they're alarmed and they're ashamed, but then with the Dauphin saying, this is shameful, let's stab ourselves, and the other saying, no, let's get back into the throng and try to turn the tide again. So they regroup. In Act 4, Scene 6, the English nobles are discussing, and they hear the report that the French are regrouping. It's at this point that Henry gives the order that the prisoners are to be killed. So this is his famous part of the battle, in the sense that it's against the laws of war, in terms of what's deemed to be humanitarian or just, even within war, is not to kill prisoners who have surrendered and put their trust into the opposing army. So there's debates to this day on whether or not, what were the circumstances in which Henry V did this, in historical fact. Why did he do this? Also in the play, what seems to be the motivation, and why is it represented this way? We'll see. As we'll see, it's actually, this order is actually given twice, and is Henry trying to give kind of a proper face to it to different people. In Act 4, Scene 7, so the next scene, we hear that the French have attacked the English camp and killed all the pages, the boys. And again, it's at this point that Henry is upset and orders the killing of the prisoners. And in Act 4, Scene 8, the identity of the king is revealed to Williams. They discover, that they've won the battle. that the French have lost full 1,500 beside common men, and the English have only lost 29. So it's seen as a miraculous, divinely inspired victory. Then in Act 5, in the chorus to that act, the chorus mentions that Henry returns to England like a triumphing Caesar. And in Act 5, Scene 1, we see Pistol saying that after an exchange with Fluellen and others, he's left alone. He says he's heard that his Nell, so remember he was married to Nell Quickly, that she's died of pox in a hospital, and that he has nothing now. So his friends have died. Bardolph's died. Nym we heard was hanged earlier. Falstaff is dead. His wife's dead. He has nothing now. He'll return to England and will lie and steal. So he'll continue his life of theft, and he'll say his lies will be that he'll say that scars that he got fighting others who other Englishmen that he was in disagreement with were scars from the Gallia Wars, from the French wars. In Act 5, Scene 2, we have this, as I said, this comic ending, because we have Henry V and the French nobles and king agreeing to the terms of their truce and a treaty for ending the war. Henry has demands which include Catherine being as he says, the capital demand. They're left alone, and Henry tries to woo her in broken French. He doesn't speak French that well, and they finally do, let's say, have a romantic agreement with one another. And like a comedy, remember we were saying histories, especially the second tetralogy, between comedy and tragedy. So here, more so comedy. It's ends with a marriage, ends with this kind of upbeat looking towards the future. However, so this is Act 5, Scene 2. Then in the last episode here is the epilogue. So the chorus comes out and says, so ended the war, etc. Thanks for everything. But reminds the audience that shortly after these events, Henry VI would rule. These French territories would be lost quite quickly, and there would be bloody internal strife during the Wars of the Roses. And he says, as our players have played for you many times already, and that's referring to the plays of the first tetralogy, the Henry VI, the three parts of Henry VI and Richard III. So that's a brief overview of what happens in the play. Now let's get to some of the background and kind of overview of what's beyond the action, what some of the themes that are at stake. So I mentioned in the introduction to Shakespeare's history plays that traditional scholarship on Shakespeare's Henry V is kind of locked in a binary debate. Either we think Shakespeare meant for us to celebrate Henry V as a great ruler and a pious Christian warrior, so short form, let's say, good king, or we see Henry V as a manipulating, ruthless ruler and willing to sacrifice morals in order to secure power. So let's say, just for shorthand, bad king. So what is Shakespeare's intention with respect to when we read the play or watch it in performance? How are we to take this character, his actions, his motives? Are we to see that as an example of proper rule? Are we to see it as an example of immoral and improper rule? So traditional scholarship has really asked us to take one side or the other. And then Norman Rabkin referred to this dualism as akin to this rabbit duck illustration used to demonstrate psychological processes in visual perception. So as you see on the right, if you see it as a rabbit, this is the eye, and this is the nose, and these are the ears. And then if you see this particular diagram as a duck, this is the bill, and this is the eye still, but this would be the back of the head as opposed to the nose, etc. But you can't see both of those images at once. You see one or the other. We can't see the two at the same time. They cannot be synthesized into a duck rabbit, says Norman Rabkin. However, Shakespeare seems to show us a ruler that is both good and bad simultaneously. So rather than try to choose duck or rabbit, my claim is let's try to see both at once if we can. So he's the closest thing in Shakespeare to what could be called the ideal ruler, I would say. So he's referred to as the mirror of all Christian kings by the chorus there. He leads with charisma, with rhetorical energy, creates critical sense of camaraderie among the men, leads them to victory against incredible odds, yet gives the credit to God. So also a humble suitor of the princess at the end. Yet, and this is not to forget the negative side, Henry's also presented as deceptive and cruel, as putting on a facade of morality in order to deceive others as to his true intentions. So he's a war criminal that orders the execution of war prisoners. We can't escape that. Someone willing to go to all lengths of violence in war to secure an objective. So there, think of the Harfleur, the Harfleur ultimatum. Someone who callously rejects and allows the execution of friends, that execution scene of Bardolph, talks of brotherhood, but at the end he distinguishes between the dead of name, the noble, and those not worthy of memorial. So in the speeches before the battle, it was all, we band of brothers, but at the end, when they were talking about the battle's over and we're talking about the deceased, he said, okay, well, let's gather the deceased of name, the nobles, and then there was, the others that were not really worthy of memorial. So if we put the two together, I think maybe we could say that Shakespeare seems to suggest that the modern regime requires a leader that synthesizes traditional categories of good and bad. So, or maybe it's more accurate to say that he's neither good nor bad in the traditional moral sense, but that a great ruler such as Henry V is a great ruler because he's willing to act in a morally suspect manner when needed, yet able to maintain an appearance of goodness. Okay, so I'm borrowing, I think, some of this from Paul A. Cantor. I think he would explain it differently, but this is kind of Cantor's point as well in terms of Henry V as leader. So for Shakespeare, the modern political problem is a tragic conflict in the Hegelian sense, as the conflict between two notions of what is right. Okay, so for Hegel, that was what was the essence of tragedy. So two notions of what is right, and they both have their equal claim. Both are it's not as though one is wrong. Both are equally right. So his play that he cites there is Antigone. He cites that to good effects. Hegel does. So you've got Antigone who insists that that her brother should have full funeral rights. She wants to stand by her brother because she has that claim, that duty as part of family, as part of duty to the gods, in terms of that being a religious right. And then Creon, who has this civic right, the right of the political community, saying no, the brother in question had led a war against, had led a warring faction against Thebes. This person is not to be given funeral honors within the context of the political community, and that also is right. You know, this is from the eyes of the political community, a traitor, a threat to the community, should not be honored and given rights within the community. So you've got this claim of the city, claim of the state on the one hand, and then you've got kind of claim of the gods, claim of the family on the other. And they're competing claims. No one can trump the other. So that to Hegel is the essence of the tragic. You've got two equal claims in conflict. And what happens is, for Hegel, in historical development, this tension between two claims can be resolved by a third higher claim, and then we have a new evolution of a new era. So here, I think for Shakespeare, the modern political problem is this type of tragic conflict between two notions of what is right, the classical and the Christian. And Shakespeare, I don't think, was thinking in Hegel's terms of that there'd be some sort of higher synthesis to be had, but that we had to live within that tension and bring them together. In Shakespeare's Roman plays, for instance, Coriolanus, for instance, Cominius can say, "It is held that valor is the chiefest virtue." So in a Roman play, for instance, we have that classical virtue being espoused. And it's, again, in Latin, virtue is tied to manliness. Vir is virtus, is tied to virtus. And for Christians in Shakespeare's day, rather than valor being the chiefest virtue, you could say something like sociability. For us today, but maybe Christians in Shakespeare's day, maybe humility, charity. So we have a set of classical virtues and Christian virtues, which for Shakespeare are in tension. And as I point out here, within the Christian framework, the chief virtues, faith, hope, and charity, they point beyond the self to another world. In Henry V, Henry reveals that he must reawaken that spirit of honor seeking, the classical virtues. And they don't sit well, though, within that Christian framework, and he's got to find a way for them to both exist together. So he says in Act 4, Scene 3, "If it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive." So he's trying to rouse this sense of honor seeking with the troops. Say, look, I'm honor seeking. Just, if that's a sin, then I'm the most offending soul alive. Well, it is a sin in the Christian framework, but he needs that, and I think we could say that Shakespeare may be saying that the modern leader, the proper leader, will instill that. And remember, that's, again, back to Machiavelli. Machiavelli's main, let's say, critique of the Christian legacy for the West has been this softening of humanity. So it doesn't allow for the growth of individual freedom-seeking, honor-seeking types. So there is a tension in loyalty between allegiance to the church as political power and allegiance to one's monarchs. That's another problem we see in this kind of tension between the classical and Christian virtues. But Christianity as an institution also presents this other political problem of the question of allegiance of the citizens to the monarch or to the church. Christianity, as opposed to the religion of the Greeks and Romans, is universal, not civic, otherworldly, not this worldly, cultivates a spirit of humility and obedience versus the spirit of the warrior. So we talked a bit about this in the introduction to the histories. So in medieval English monarchy, as displayed in Shakespeare's history, what we see is a divided loyalty between church and to lord. The king as weak, so we see that in a number of the different kings. Remember, we saw Richard II, King John, Henry VI. So a number of these monarchs' weakness is at play, and part of that in some cases will be because of the divided loyalty, or because their nobility are the ones that have real power. And we also see succession problems in all of these plays. So succession in monarchy is one of these kind of Achilles heels to that as an institution. If there is not a clear succession, it can always lead to power struggles and internal strife. So Shakespeare dramatizes these problems of the medieval feudal system and the determining factors in the transition to the modern regime. So he kind of follows Machiavelli and shows that what we really need is control the influence of the church and get the subjects to focus on prospering in this world and to cultivate the independent spirit of the warrior. Here's a timeline that I also used in the introduction to the histories, but just as a reminder, if you didn't watch that lecture, we are dealing with the second tetralogy. It's the second tetralogy, that the second set of 4 plays of English history that Shakespeare wrote. It deals with this period in time from 1398 to 1415. Now, Henry V deals with a very small sliver of that in 1415, leading up to the Battle of Agincourt, which is its end. And the context of that is the 100 Years' War with France, where there were considerable gains of territory under Henry V, which were lost under Henry VI, and finally ended in 1453. So in the second tetralogy, we starts with Richard II. We have a weak king, does not lead troops into battle. Henry V, obviously strong king, does that. He believes God will protect him as a monarch. He represents really this medieval view of kingship. And he's deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who crowns himself Henry IV. In Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, we see Henry IV as this modern calculating ruler, but he is illegitimate. So because he's illegitimate, because he usurped the throne, he's got a number of nobles who are after his throne, saying, well, if you can just take it because anybody can take it, then sure, I'll give it a shot. He wants to suppress rebellion through a crusade. So he keeps wanting to have this holy crusade to Jerusalem that he thinks will expiate him from the sins of having usurped the throne. He gives his advice to his son, who becomes Henry V, is, be it thy course to busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels. So Henry IV is never able to do this. He's always suppressing his own rebellions, but Henry V seems to kind of take up that advice. So basically what the first action we see Henry V undertake as a ruler in Shakespeare is to start a war with France, to busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels. There's a prophecy that Henry IV will die in Jerusalem, but he discovers that he's in a room in a castle named Jerusalem. So there's part of the irony of him wanting to get to Jerusalem to purify himself, but he dies without doing that. Henry V will unite England under a legitimate imperial project. So in Henry IV, part 1 and 2, we see Hal hanging around with lower class characters, drunks and criminals, including the comic braggadocio Falstaff. So we'll talk about Falstaff later, but a real interesting character, one of the most famous Shakespearean characters, interesting characters in the Shakespearean oeuvre. So if you haven't read Henry IV, part 1 in particular, I recommend reading that. But Hal says he's doing this in order to get to know his people. So Henry V is disappointed in Hal, his son, who becomes Henry V, the hero of our play. But at the time, in Henry IV, part 1 and 2, he's this dissolute youth, and his father, other nobles, they're disappointed in him because hanging around with these drunks and thieves, and feels like he's going to be wasting his potential. Hal says he's doing this in order to get to know his people, and he says, drink with any tinker in his own language. And this is one of the things we actually do end up seeing in Henry, is he knows the people. And remember this as a characteristic of leadership. Remember Agamemnon did not know the people, did not know the tenor and the mood of the people. Henry V knows his people, knows them well. He can drink with any tinker in his own language. So he's doing this. He's also doing this so when he renounces all of these things, his image as a king will shine more brightly. And we see this in the first scene. The bishops who are discussing Henry V, the king, say, how he's like a prodigal son. It seemed as though he had been lost to a sinful life, and now he shines the more brightly, and he's gained more respect and more reverence because of that. So in summary, in the first play, Richard II, we have a legitimate monarch, but weak. And so he's tied to this kind of medieval standard of ruling. In Henry IV, we have a strong monarch, but illegitimate and tied to the modern notion of rule. If he's got the power, he should take it over. Whereas Richard's got this medieval standard for ruling. I'm divinely anointed. I don't have to worry about anything. God will protect me. So this is over extremely medieval view, where he doesn't even try to protect his own, take serious steps to secure his monarchy. And then the other extreme of what rules is power. So let's say an extreme modern view. Henry V needs to bring the two together to some extent. He needs to be legitimate and strong. He needs to be a more complete version of the modern ruler. I'll mention quickly here the sources. Edward Hall, Raphael Holinshed, the two chroniclers are major sources, especially Holinshed. There's an earlier drama that deals with the story of Henry V, including his dissolute youth, all in one play. So material that Shakespeare had broken up into a couple of plays, and then Henry V, his acts as a ruler, those are all covered in this one play called The Famous Victories of Henry V. So what you get in that play is really this story of the prodigal son. So dissolute youth, and then shining victory. Two other sources, not overtly referred to, but definitely in the background that we'll keep in mind, are Plato's Phaedo, which includes the description of Socrates' death. And we'll look at that when we look at Falstaff's death. And then Niccolo Machiavelli, and we've had course to mention him already. The chorus. So first of all, it's rare in Shakespeare. It's there's similar instances in other plays. There's the prologues to Romeo and Juliet and Troilus and Cressida. There's a character named Ancient Gower in Pericles who performs a type of prologue function. There's a rumor and epilogue at the beginning and the end of the second part of Henry IV. This chorus, though, this chorus is unique. It starts every act, and it's somewhat different than these other functions. The chorus says he's going to act prologue-like. The nuntius is a theater term for a messenger, for Latin for nuntius, who reports actions taking place off stage. So it's a bit of that. It's a bit of a prologue function, bit of a messenger function, but somewhat different. Let's look at the first speech of the chorus. So this is the opening of the play. First lines of the play, the solitary actor comes out. I like this artistic representation of reminder of we have this jutting stage there with the yard, with the commoners standing around. We've got some tiered seats in the back. They're slightly more expensive. We've got this balcony. Well, there's the balcony here, but this this tiered roof that on which was the heavens were portrayed. There's a little depiction of this cellar. So there's a trapdoor there that can represent characters coming up from either from the earth or from hell. So this character comes out, addresses the crowd as a chorus and says, "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. But pardon, gentles all, the flat, unraised spirits that hath dared on this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very casques that did affright the air at Agincourt? Oh, pardon, since a crooked figure may attest in little place a million, and let us, ciphers, to this great account, on your imaginary forces work. Suppose within the girdles of these walls are now confined two mighty monarchies, whose high upreared and abutting fronts the perilous narrow ocean parts asunder. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. Into 1,000 parts divide one man, and make imaginary puissance. Think, when we talk of horses, that you see them printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth, for 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings, carry them here and there, jumping o'er times, turning the accomplishment of many years into an hourglass, for the which supply admit me chorus to this history, who prologue like your humble patience pray, gently to hear, kindly to judge our play." So this beginning chorus begins with a epic invocation of sorts. So he says, "Oh, for a muse of fire." So there's a lot of classical references in the play, and right off the bat, it has almost a Homeric tone to it, and it points to the world of classical epic also, as we'll see, in terms of the warrior virtues that Henry wants to instill in his troops. He also notes that Harry would assume the port of Mars. So Mars, obviously the Roman version of Ares, the god of war. And the point of departure is that the chorus is a friend of Harry. He uses the diminutive Harry as opposed to the more formal Henry. So maybe the chorus is going to give us a privileged mode of access to Henry, since the chorus is able to call him Harry, so to speak. I'll also point out this notion of the wooden O, and we have a picture here of the restored Globe Theater from the yard, and when looking up, you can see this wooden O. It's because it's made in this circular pattern, and it's open to the sky. It does have this feeling of being a wooden O, and a reminder of the line, "Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very casques that did affright the air at Agincourt?" So on the need for imagination, so I think the first speech is really important for a couple of reasons. Remember, we said one of the things that recurs in a lot of the works that we're looking at that deal with war is how war can't be represented, or that there's a whole, that the dimensions of war can't be represented, the deaths cannot be represented, that the experience of death and the experience of being so near death can't be represented, because it's not something that the living have lived through and are able to come back and tell us about. And here the chorus makes a big deal of that and says how, literally you can't bring forth the battle, but the stage, in a way, the point they want to make is that the stage is an empty space, and the wooden O becomes kind of like this blank space, or a zero, a nothing that can be filled with whatever you want to put in, right? So the chorus is making a virtue out of this nothingness, that this place is nothing. It's just this little wooden O, but an O is like a zero. It's like a cipher that can represent millions, or it can be an empty space that your imagination fills. So a couple of other things that are connected with the wooden O in the speech is that it's like a cask, a barrel, like a cask of ale, let's say, is like a wooden O. And we have that, let's say, homophony with casque or helmet. So casque is the word used there for helmet. Can it bring forth the casques that did affright the air in Agincourt, but can it bring forth also these, can the wooden O be these barrels? And this notion of a cipher or crooked figure it represents, a zero that in its placement can multiply numbers, can create a million, as he says there. That's another way in which this wooden O becomes different figures, a casque, a barrel, a helmet, so something that will wear on your head, a zero or a cipher, and also this empty space for the imagination. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. I want to mention the unreliability of the chorus. So the chorus has the function of narrating and filling in the gaps and directing the audience's attention. But the chorus has a point of view, it seems. The chorus is pointing our attention to the greatness of Henry V's achievement, but there's a question of the reliability of the chorus. So, for instance, chorus to Act 2 opens by stating that honor's thought reigns solely in the breast of every man. Yet that chorus, so this is part of the prologue to Act 2 that's saying everybody's so gung-ho behind the war, except what's shown right after that are the drunks and thieves in Eastcheap who only want to go to war in order to make some money off it, not because they're so driven with honor seeking. And then it shows the conspiracy plot. So the action that's shown afterwards belies some of the high rhetoric of the chorus. There's also this question when we see the chorus to Act 3, which describes the fleet sailing to Harfleur, leaving England, quote, guarded with grandsires, babies, and old women. So it's basically saying that all the fighting age men have come from England and they're there. Yet earlier the decision was made in Act 1, Scene 2 to take only 1/4 of England's military strength to France, and they wanted to keep a very healthy defense there in case the Scottish were to threaten invasion from the north while they were fighting in France. And then later, similarly, in the at the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, emphasis is placed on the small numbers of forces. Remember, we said, oh, they've got 60,000, we've only got a few, and Westmoreland says, oh, I wish we had a few more. So the fact that they're greatly outnumbered, that they've only got a few people, is also emphasized. So again, the chorus mentioning that all of England has gone. Well, first of all of them are so ramped up for the war, and then all of them have sailed over. Both of those points seem to be belied by the actual action. In the chorus to Act 4, and we'll look at this speech as well. We'll look at parts of it. Describes the evening before the Battle of Agincourt, with Harry providing comfort and raising the morale of the troops. So the chorus describes Henry's effect on the men. The chorus says, every wretch beholding him plucks comfort from his looks. Yet, as I mentioned when I did the summary, Harry only goes to the troops in disguise, so no one knows he's there, so it's not as though they're getting comfort. And rather than bringing comfort, he gets into a disagreement with them. And the chorus laments that 4 or 5 most vile and ragged foils will not represent Agincourt, yet we don't really see the battle. We only get the reports of the battle. The only swords displayed are that of Pistol and his French prisoner in Act 4, Scene 4. So there's not even 4 swords. So this is from the chorus of Act 4. The poor condemned English, like sacrifices by their watchful fires, sit patiently and inly ruminate the morning's danger. And their gesture sad, investing lank lean cheeks and war-worn coats, presenteth them unto the gazing moon so many horrid ghosts. Oh, now, who will behold the royal captain of this ruined band, walking from watch to watch, from tent to tent? Let him cry, praise and glory on his head, for forth he goes and visits all his host, bids them good morrow, and with a modest smile, and calls them brothers, friends, and countrymen. Upon his royal face there is no note how dread an army hath enrounded him, nor doth he dedicate one jot of color unto the weary and all watch at night. Excuse me. But freshly looks and overbears a taint with cheerful semblance and sweet majesty, that every wretch, pining and pale before, beholding, plucks comfort from his looks. A largesse universal, like the sun, his liberal eye doth give to everyone. Thawing cold fear that mean and gentle all behold, as may unworthiness define a little touch of Harry in the night. And so our scene must to the battle fly, where, oh, for pity, we shall much disgrace with 4 or 5 most vile and ragged foils, right ill disposed in brawl ridiculous, the name of Agincourt. Yet sit and see, minding true things by what their mockeries be. So that's the chorus to Act 4. And again, so we see the expectation that's set up there is belied by the actual action. So there's that question of the reliability of the chorus. So the chorus is, as I said, this seems to be one that wants to rouse us for the plays, for the action, for Henry V. The chorus wants us to see the play as a rousing affirmation of triumphant English nationalism, of the greatness of the cause, of the greatness of Henry V. And then when we actually see happening, in some ways is in tension with that. And so I'll just point out that, that the standard interpretation of the play for the longest time has been solely this interpretation that sees it as a celebration of an English triumph, not as at all as a self-questioning. For the longest time that had been, and it wasn't till late in the 20th century that this at all was questioned. And as Sharon Tyler reflects, quote, for nearly 400 years, audiences have been seeing what is described rather than what is staged. So if one way, let's say one way of taking a different view of the play is this questioning of the chorus. And what we'll get to next time, I'm going to end the lecture there, but what we'll get into next time is a bit more unpacking of this, what I would call the skeptical interpretation that calls into question this standard interpretation. Thank you very much.